Every single image shown in this video was taken with Nikon Zf. Now, I've shot weddings since 2011, and I shot on DSLR and mirrorless in the past few years. In this video, I'm going to share my experience using Nikon Zf. Now, this is not my first wedding, obviously, photographing, but this was my first wedding using Nikon Zf. I have some things to share, so you be the judge whether Nikon Zf will work for your wedding workflow based on your style and maybe lenses that you use. Now, I shot over 3,000 images at this last wedding, and my primary camera was actually a Nikon Z9, where I shot maybe 2/3 of my images, and maybe another 1/3 I shot with Nikon Zf, which was close to 850 images. For some of you who might be familiar with Nikon Zf, Nikon Zf is a 24.5 megapixel sensor with an X-Speed 7 processor, which is basically the same as Nikon Z9, Nikon Z8, and more recently with Nikon Z6 III. The camera features a 5-axis in-body vibration reduction. The camera shoots 96 megapixel high-res images when you stack them together. The camera comes in this nice, beautiful retro style, which I found this to be very classy, especially using for weddings. The camera has dual card slots, the SD card and macro SD card, which I shoot RAW on the SD card, and then I shoot JPEGs sort of as a backup on the micro SD card. Now, I would not use the camera if it did not have a dual card slots, because historically cameras can fail, and having a backup, having a card slot as a backup is a very critical and important feature for me personally. The camera also shoots mechanical shutter up to 1/8000 of a second, and I believe the camera shoots up to 14 frames per second in mechanical shutter. This camera has some of the crazy video features. The camera shoots in H.265 in 4K up to 30 frames per second, and that will be in the full frame. And you can go down to 60 frames per second, but that one will be cropped internally. The camera records up to 125 minutes of uninterrupted video. You can charge the camera internally via USB-C. Externally, camera actually records a 422 10-bit via HDMI, for those to whom some of the video features are important. As most of you know, the camera has beautiful 3.2-inch fully articulated screen, and I'm gonna talk about that a little bit later when it comes from a standpoint of photographer. Now, ergonomics for the most part wasn't much of an issue using this camera. However, because I was using hold-fast straps, and a little bit more on that later, I'm going to talk about my personal maybe issues that I experienced using this camera. You know, this is probably maybe vain, but I actually do enjoy the shutter sound mechanical shutter sound on the Nikon Zf more than I like it on Nikon Z9, even though Nikon Z9 was my primary camera to shoot with. Now, if you're using this camera primarily holding like this for the entire wedding, I would highly recommend that you invest and get some sort of an L-shaped bracket like as this one that I have. And this one is made by Small Rig that I personally purchased. Now, I think you can get something similar. I believe Newer makes a very similar bracket, but it does significantly improves your ergonomics. Basically, as you can see, once you attach the L bracket to it, you really have something to hold on to, rather than just pretty much holding a little brick. There's a very, very tiny sort of like a angulation or indentation that you have within this camera here. I'm not sure if you can tell. Basically, that kind of gives you a little bit more ergonomics to be able to hold the camera. But I would say, you know, using it for the entire wedding just like this, it may not be the best unless you have some kind of like a sling, or maybe you have a strap generally to use. But I would suggest if you're using it without any straps at all, this is much more ergonomically appropriate way to handle this camera. Now, let me talk a little bit about what worked very well for this camera? Camera is small and light. I really enjoyed using it. I've been using this camera for probably over a year and a half at this point, and I'm not using so much of these nice tactile functions here at the top here, because when I'm shooting a wedding, I pretty much set everything onto manual mode, where I was using the front dial up here, and I was using also the back dial back here. And for my ISO changes, I was using the record button. You hold that, and then you use the back dial basically to switch your ISO. So that's kind of how I'm using the camera. But if you're using it for street photography or some portraits, or just really for experience, it is certainly, I admit, very, very nice to use these functions back here on top. Let me talk a little bit about autofocus. The autofocus on this camera is absolutely spectacular. When you're shooting this camera during the day, it really, when you put on IAF, it does a stellar job. Especially when you're using like a 3D function that really, you know, once you put this on the person and captures their eye, it'll follow. If you have your bride and groom, they're walking around, it will, and you want to capture some of the, you know, sort of a candid shots, it does very good job. Now, when it comes to lenses, this is one of the things that what I personally learned and I want to share with you is not every lens is going to work very well on this, just because this is a small body camera. Now, my recommendation is that you go with something, you know, some of the lenses that worked well and I tested on this camera when it comes to ergonomics is the 28mm f2.8. It works good. It sits well. In fact, that lens is more or less designed for this camera, like an SE version. The next one is 35mm f1.8 S lens, 50mm f1.8, and this is where I have mine. I use this combination quite a bit, and this is what it looks like. Okay, it's not big, it's not small, it's just right. Okay, it's not front heavy. So 50mm f1.8 is a good combination to use on this one. If you were to be using the 50mm f1.2, that lens would be a little bit front heavy. Another recommendation that I would make is for you to use, I use for a wedding this Viltrox 27mm f1.2. Now, while this lens is a little bit heavier than the 50mm f1.8, it's not still too front heavy. And as you can see, this is nice little combo up here. It looks great. You'll probably gonna get some comments, positive comments. Hey, you know, nice little camera, nice little lens. It sits well, super tight. I've shot quite a few images using this lens. The next lens that I also used and I recommend that still works well when it comes to ergonomics is the 85mm f1.8 S lens. Again, it's not too front heavy. This is what it looks like. Obviously a little bit longer than any of these lenses, which will be the 50mm or the 27mm 1.2. Now, I know some of you may comment, well, you're putting a crop sensor lens or design for crop sensor cameras onto the full frame camera. I fully understand this. I only shot limited number of images, but enough to test it, and it works very well because you're going to get about 10 to 12 megapixel images when you're using this particular lens. Now, if you're looking to use one of the most versatile lenses ever for wedding photography, which will be the 24 to 70mm f2.8, this lens becomes a little bit front heavy. You still can shoot. Again, you're gonna get great images. This is a great camera, this is a great lens, but the camera becomes a little bit too front heavy. As you can see, it puts quite a bit of a strain on your wrist if you're holding it like this for a long time. If you have a camera attached to something like a strap, it's probably not going to be so much of an issue. but that's not the combination that I typically go out with when it comes to wedding photography. If you're doing some portraits here and there, you know, maybe using it for an hour, probably okay. But if you're using it for a full day and maybe you're a prime shooter, any of these lenses that I just suggested, the 27mm f1.2, 50mm f1.8, 85mm f1.8. If you're using a 35mm, that will work very well. 28mm f2.8 will work very well. Other lenses that I personally shot becomes a little bit too front heavy. Obviously, you know, you can put 70-200 on this one, but it's gonna be way too front heavy. So these are my combinations. It worked very well for me. I enjoy the camera. I enjoy using these lenses, but this is what my experience was like with these specific lenses. Now let's talk a little bit about the ISO, especially using it at night. This is a 24 megapixel sensor. I use the Z9, has a 45 megapixel sensor. I do find that usually you get cleaner images overall because the pixel density on the sensor is a little bit bigger, so is able to capture more light. Now, I'm not an expert in all the sensors and megapixels, and you know, please feel free to put some comments in the description below when it comes to what you're getting when it comes to the 24 megapixel sensor versus higher resolution sensors. But it works very well on this one at nighttime. Now I brought with me 3 batteries, EN EL15C, and I might have used maybe only battery and a half, I would say. If you were, you know, just primarily shooting photography, I didn't do any video with this camera. Now let me talk about things that I maybe did not like, or maybe, you know, would put it out there for your consideration if you're looking to use this camera for wedding photography. Now, this is not so much of a function of this camera itself, but given the fact that this camera features a fully articulated screen, now if you are not using any straps, if you're just really hand holding, this is a nice function when you want to shoot vertically. You hold it as you typically do. You may want to put your hand underneath and shoot for vertical shots if you're actually going for like a low angle shots like this. Now, here was my personal problem. Again, this may not be an issue for you, but what I experienced was because I was using hold fast straps, this is what I had. Now, when you attach this camera to a hold fast strap or any other strap that's similar, like that functions like this, and you're looking to shoot sort of vertically, this is what I encountered. Even though you can kind of put your camera down like this, your strap really end up blocking your screen quite a bit. Sometimes I find myself, I was doing things like this, and it's not maybe ergonomically as decent. Now, if you're shooting a vertical shots like this, if you're shooting a typical horizontal shots like this, it's not a big deal. It works very well. The only problem I had was when I was switching the camera and then putting it vertically, that's when I was kind of like, the strap was becoming an obstruction for me to shoot with. But other than that, again, this is my personal issue, because you may not be shooting the way I'm using camera. You might be perfectly fine, but that's kind of what I experienced here. And then the last challenge that I found was with this camera. You know how I spoke about that autofocus is great? It is absolutely great during the day. It was at nighttime, specifically when people were dancing. Not necessarily stationary, where people sitting at the tables, but when they were dancing and when the lights are very low, the camera had a difficulty focusing on people's faces. Obviously, people dance, their hands go everywhere, and in a low light situation, like a very low light, and I'm talking about just the DJ lights only on. So here are some images that I have. You know, the camera basically misfocused. I want to be able to focus on people's faces or people's expressions, capture but some images came out blurry because it was just either focusing too far or too close, or maybe camera couldn't really understand what I'm trying to capture, even though it was set onto IAF. And again, that probably was only 10% of my time. So Z9 worked very well. I had no problems with Z9. Almost every single image that I have with Z9 was actually sharp, but with the ZF, the camera struggled a little bit in low light for focusing at nighttime. But other than that, these are my two things. It's just when I was using it for vertical shoots, using my strap, as well as the focusing at nighttime. All right, so here are my, when I say final recommendations, take it with a grain of salt. Should this be your only primary wedding camera for, let's say, 8 or 10 hour wedding? I probably would say no. Could this camera be used as for a smaller wedding as a primary camera? So maybe it's 3 to 4 hour wedding. Probably yes. Would the ZF be a great second camera for an entire 8 to 10 hour wedding? Absolutely yes. As you can see, the camera delivers beautiful images. If you're interested to know what exactly I brought to me with my last wedding that I shot with the ZF, I recently posted a video, what's in my wedding camera bag, and if you're curious, I'm going to put it in the description below. Click on that link and you can watch that after that. But this is an amazing second camera. It really is. This camera is great for elopement weddings, something more like a non-traditional, intimate, but intentional weddings where couple focuses on their experience, and it's usually shorter weddings for 4 or 5 hours maybe. This camera is great for portrait shoots, engagement shoots. It's really ideal for street photography, especially with some of the smaller lenses that I showed earlier. This camera is great for travel. I actually have taken this camera when I was traveling. I also put that video in the description below if you're curious to see what it's like using this camera when you're traveling. This is a fantastic camera for video. It shoots 4K 60, has a stellar IAF doing video, H.265, has a great IBIS. One of the things that this camera features that other cameras do not is the black and white function, where you can simply switch, and if you're shooting in JPEG, it will basically bake in your black and white mode. But if you're shooting in RAW, even when you try to shoot in black and white, your images will be in color, but you can switch into the black and white after that. And when you're using this camera with the smaller lenses, particularly prime lenses, as 50mm, 35, and 85, where all of them are 1.8, it sits well. It's not too front heavy. Once you start switching to other lenses, more pro lenses, if you will, where it's f1.2, 50mm, or even 85mm f1.2, it becomes a little bit front heavy. But other than that, this is a beautiful camera. I would absolutely use it again and again and again on my future wedding shoots. And I would love to hear from you if you guys used this camera before on any of your wedding shoots, or maybe like a evening events, or just day events. I would love to hear your experience using this camera. I hope you found this content entertaining, but more importantly educational. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, because this allows me to make more content like this for viewers like you. Thank you.